Good evening from Vietnam. Good morning to you, Paulo. Thank you very much for being so nice to join our show and share your stories with our global audience. And on behalf of the listeners around the world, we want to say thank you to you.
Thank you. Hi, and good evening to you. And I'm grateful to be on your show. Thank you.
Hey, since you haven't been to my country, and as I say earlier, please put it to your bucket list so that hopefully one day, if you and your wife decided to travel to this part of the world, you have a new friend, new family. We're gonna be here. We're gonna take you around town. Okay?
That sounds great. I look forward to that.
And for a little taste of our culture, Paulo, it's very honor for our audience if we can have you to do a little introduction about who you are and the works you are doing. Can you do that for us, please?
Of course. So my name is Paolo Gaudiano, and currently I am the founder and chief scientist of a small company called Aleria. The focus of Aleria is on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but from a somewhat unique angle because it is focused on measuring inclusion, which is something that a lot of people don't do. Most people focus really on measuring diversity. We've come up with a unique way of measuring inclusion, which actually leads to companies that are more successful and more diverse. So we think that inclusion is that ingredient that is necessary for companies to be able to sustain greater diversity and also at the same time to make more money.
Wow. Thanks a lot. During, the DE&I has been here for a long time, but during the pandemic, we started hearing it from all over the world, all over the news, and you spend decades of your life to work onto that DE&I, especially in inclusion. So this conversation today, we're going to examine how it leads you to doing that, and we want to pick your brains on that. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
Alrighty, but before that, let's travel time. We believe that everything has a beginning for that. So we want to know how that journey leading to what you are doing. So let's start with you when you were young. Okay. So when I was a little boy, I dream of traveling in different planet, wearing the astronaut suit and jumping in different planets. Seems really cool to me. I didn't have a chance to do anything close to what I wanted to do. All right. So when Paulo was young, was a little boy, what was his vision about his future self, though?
It's a really good question. And when I was young, I remember that my first desire in terms of a career was that I loved the sea and I loved animals. And I always thought I want to grow up and be a marine biologist. That was kind of my first memory of actually wanting to do anything specific. And by the way, I was born and raised in Italy. I lived in Italy until I was about 16, and then I came to the United States around that age, and then I went back, and then eventually moved to the United States permanently in my late teens when I was 18, 19, actually 19 years old. And along the way, I had really been passionate about animals. I'd always had pets and always enjoyed, at one point with a friend of mine when I was a kid, we raised some pigeons. So animals were something that I really, really enjoyed. And then eventually I decided that what I really liked was things like computers and mathematics and engineering. I discovered computers when the very, very first Apple computers came out in the 1970s. And I thought, oh my God, this is so much fun. I really want to do it. And I was very passionate about things that were mechanical and just being able to work with both with my hands and with my brain at the same time. For a number of years, actually, I felt that I was going to be an automotive engineer. So I really wanted to design cars. And especially once I moved to the United States, I learned to really appreciate Italian cars. And so I used to think, well, someday I'll be able to actually design cars for a company like Alfa Romeo or Ferrari. I even worked as a mechanic for about a year in Italy, loved working with cars. I raced motorcycles very much, always enjoyed that. And then eventually my career changed pretty dramatically when I was finishing my undergraduate degree, and I somewhat serendipitously took a course on how the brain works. And it was a course that was taught from an engineering department. And I marveled at the fact that the brain was this incredible machine, if you want to think of it that way. I mean, it's really not a machine, but this incredibly complex system. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is so much fun. This is what I really want to do when I grow up. And so eventually I ended up getting a master's degree. It was in aerospace engineering, but all of my work was done in neuroscience, or all of my thesis work and some of the research that I was doing was in neuroscience. And ultimately that led me to a PhD in computational neuroscience and becoming a professor where I taught neural networks. Now you might say these all sound like very strange things, and what do they have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm happy to get to that, but let me stop there and give you a chance to ask any questions that you may have.
Well, it's beautiful. So I didn't know that you grew up in Italy and then you moved to the States, and then you moved back onto the Italy and you back to the States. All right. So I think from there that somehow we link to the works that you're doing, because from Italian get into enter into the to America, there's a lot of things differently between the cultures and the works, and I'm really intrigued to figure it out together with you. All right. But let me bring you back to the point that young Paolo wanted to become a marine. I wrote that is marine biology, right? And
Right.
from marine biology, that's a dream when you was in Italy, right? And then when you move to America, you still can be a marine biologist. You can still pursue that dream. But why you decided to move into the mechanical engineer though?
I'm one of these people that I've never really had one thing that I wanted to do. And I've been really, really fortunate that I've been able to do things that I love. And I tend to be very distracted. I like to think of myself as there's the expression Renaissance man, to connote people that are very good in a number of different fields. And if I say, if there's one thing that I'm really passionate about, that I've always been passionate about, is being able to do a lot of different things, being able to pursue different passions, being able to see something interesting and jump into it. And from that perspective, I've been really lucky because I was able to always find something that I was passionate about and pursue it. So it wasn't so much that I had a dream of something that I wanted to do. It was more that I wanted to be able to have the possibility to try a lot of different things in life without really getting bogged down into a single-minded career. That was something that to me always sounded very unattractive. The idea of, I'm going to start a job and I'm going to stay in the same job my entire life.
So by the time that you figured out the beauty of neuroscience, then it looks like that your whole career from there and your research from there move into one direction, right? So why moving from, what happened in the neuroscience field that triggers the interest inside of Paulo?
Well, if there is a common thread to pretty much all of the work that I've done since my master's and maybe even before that, is this idea of complexity. It's the idea of how you can take a number of elements that by themselves may not be very significant or powerful, and when you put them together, you get something very different. When I was studying neuroscience, I studied parts of how our nervous system, our brain, is able to do things like how do we see, how do we move, how is it that very simple little neurons in our brain, which by themselves are very noisy, squishy little things, when you put them together, you can do these amazing things. And half of my PhD dissertation was on study how the retina works. And a lot of people don't realize the retina is actually part of your brain. It's actually neurons that reach out from your brain, or rather the neurons in the retina reach into your brain. And I was really stunned by how do we take a system that by itself is not very powerful, and yet you can go from starlight at night to a sunny day on a snowfield and still be able to see. How can we possibly do that? And it turns out that it's the way of bringing a lot of items together, a lot of neurons together that collaborate and they give us vision. And I was always fascinated by that notion. I built computer simulations to understand that. And now the work that I'm doing is very similar in that now I'm looking at how people within a society or within a company give rise to these things that we see, whether they're negative things like racism and social injustices, or positive things like creating companies and building things and doing new inventions that are done as teams, as societies. And that thread has stayed with me for my entire life. So when I was thinking about marine biology, I was really fascinated by the idea of ecosystems. And even later, when I was thinking about working on cars, I was fascinated by the idea of how you take a lot of mechanical pieces and turn them into something amazing, like a race car, for example. And then I studied neurons, and that's why I think, well, first I learned to study, to use computers, and I was really fascinated with the idea that you could somehow take a bunch of zeros and ones and make it do amazing things. And then later, same idea with the brain, essentially, is what kind of literally blew my mind, pun intended. And ultimately, the work that I'm doing right now is still using the same kinds of concepts, except in this case, it's about how do you connect the behaviors of individuals to what happens within the collective, whether the collective is a city or a company or an entire country. So in a way, there has been that consistency throughout my life, and those ideas have really shaped my thinking in a lot of different ways. I've worked as a consultant where we use that idea of complexity to help companies understand a large number of different kinds of problems. And now, as I said, for the last 8 years or so, I've been focused specifically on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the methodology and the ideas and the concept has been with me for pretty much my entire life.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for making it clear for us. So in the past 8 years, your focus attention was on diversity and inclusion, right? But the society has a lot of problems. We as human beings, we have a lot of problems. So why diversity and inclusion, Paolo?
Yeah, well, in fact, it's nice that you've been asking me about my past, because my interest in diversity and inclusion in a way started when I was 14. I came to the United States on vacation with my parents. It was the first time that I remember that I was here, and we stayed in Santa Barbara, California, for about 3 months in the summertime. My father was a visiting professor at the university, and when I was there, I made friends. We lived in this big apartment building in California. It was beautiful, you know, palm trees and a swimming pool. And my brothers and I made friends with 2 kids from the building, and I didn't really speak English. I was learning a little bit. It was the first time that I was exposed to English. So in a few weeks, I learned a few basic words, and I could kind of understand a few things. And these 2 kids, one of them was my age, so I played with him all the time, and it turns out that he was black. And at one point, we had been playing for several weeks. We'd become what I consider to be friends. And one day he asked me a question, and he said, "Do you think I am a Negro?" And I thought maybe I didn't understand what he was saying. And in Italian, the word at the time, the only word that existed for a black person is negro. It's just, it didn't really have a positive or a negative connotation. So I was really confused. And then he asked me again, "Do you think I'm a Negro?" And so I thought, yes. I answered yes. And he jumped on me and started punching me. And I thought, what is going on? Why is he doing this? And so I didn't want to get in a fight. So I ran home and I explained to what had happened to my parents. My parents had been in the United States before, so they understood about racial tension in the United States. And so they went to talk to his parents and try to explain to him what had happened. But that kid never wanted to play with me again. And that was the first time that I thought, this is really weird. How is it that there is this weird thing that because of difference in skin color, all of a sudden there are these kinds of behaviors? And I grew up in a country that is very homogeneous. And there are forms of racism in Italy, as I realized later when I was growing up. But that was the first time that I really became aware of the fact there are these differences. And then over time, I had a number of other experiences, both having to do with race, with gender, where I was keenly aware that there were these discrepancies and these inequalities, and it bothered me. I thought that it was really bad. I thought that it was unfair. I thought it was unjust. But I always felt that you're either going to be an activist, which I'm not really the kind. I mean, I've gone to marches and I believe in supporting causes, but I'm not really an activist. Or I thought there's not a whole lot that I can do. Until eventually one day I realized that one of what I saw as the big problems, about a little more than 8 years ago, I thought, well, one of the big problems that I see whenever I go to a conference, I may go to a session on diversity and inclusion, and I may hear people talk about the problems that they have. And they're very poignant stories about things that happen to them because they're black or because they're a woman or because they're gay. But when it came to solutions, it was these very vague ideas. You know, we need to change the hearts and minds of corporate America. And I was literally one day sitting in one of these sessions thinking, what can I do? And how do you connect those individual stories with what happens at the macroscopic level? And then I thought, wait a second, this is exactly what I've been doing for the past almost 20 years. Has been figuring out how to quantify the link between the individual and the collective. And I thought, what if I can take my computer simulations and the work that I've been doing first as a professor and then as a consultant, what if I can apply to this space? What if I can actually do something that can be good for society by leveraging my strengths? And that's how I got 8 years ago. I literally dropped everything else that I was doing. I began building some of my own computer simulations and doing some research and talking to people and educating myself. And so before I had been personally, there was like this thread where I was personally interested in diversity and inclusion, and professionally I felt that I was doing something very different. And then 8 years ago they merged, and I realized that there was an amazing opportunity to bring all of my experience as an academic, as a consultant, as a researcher, as a human being, and bring them all together to address what I really think is the most complex, most fascinating problem that I've ever worked on.
Beautiful, beautiful, and I like I like the action that you take, because you've been taking, because without measurement and without actions, then everything was just on the table, on the discussions. And around the world, we heard a lot of, companies put initiatives onto, building a better culture and promoting D&I. But then not a lot of that is being measured so that we can see how it progresses and, related to the performance. We're going to get to that point. Okay, we're going to get to that point. But before we get there, a lot of our audience are still confusing about the definition of, the basics. So I want to go to the basics first. So the D and the I, can you share with us what's the similarity between the two of them, and diversity and inclusion? What's the similarity and what's the differences between the two, so that make sure that we understand, and the root of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think that even today, for most people, there is a lot of confusion about that. And in fact, one of the things that I'm most, I don't want to say proud, but one of the things that I think is most tangibly useful about the work that I do is that by doing the research that I've been doing, I've come up with a very, very different way of thinking about inclusion. If you go and you do a search online, or you talk to people and you ask them about diversity and inclusion, diversity, most everybody agrees with. It's about the fact that you have a group of people in which somebody has different characteristics, whether they're ethnic, cultural, gender, whatever the case might be. When it comes to inclusion, if you do a search, you will find 1,000 different definitions, and they're all different. I've seen definitions that were literally contradicting one another. One of the more famous ones that a lot of people talk about is that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And that definition is very nice because intuitively gives you the sense between, well, I can just be a number in a room, but if I'm not part of things, then I'm not feeling included. The problem is, it's a great definition to give you an intuition, but if you're trying to run a company and decide whether or not you should do diversity and inclusion, it doesn't really help you, because what are you going to do unless you're doing parties all the time? It doesn't really help you. I've come to realize that one of the problems with inclusion is that people think of it in many different ways. They think about the feelings of inclusion of an individual. So, oh, I feel like you're excluding me. That's not a very good feeling. Oh, I feel like I'm part of the team. That's a very good feeling. But then there is inclusion in other senses. People say, well, if we're going to be offering a job to people, we want to offer it to a lot of different kinds of people. That's being inclusive. Well, but now it's very different. Now you're talking about the company, and you're talking about really diversity under a different guise. Then there are people talking about the culture of inclusion. Well, the company has to have a culture of inclusion. And like, well, what does that mean? I mean, ultimately, the culture is not like an object that you can see and feel. So I've learned to be very careful in defining diversity and inclusion. And first of all, we need to understand, are we talking about a company, or are we talking about people? And I think that that's one of the biggest points of confusion. So to me, the way that I define it is actually very simple. Inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get. What do I mean by
Diversity,
that?
what you get. Okay.
Correct. Right. If you look at a company and you see, and I'm using companies as an example, but the same idea could apply to society, could apply to any collective of people. If you look at the diversity of a company, the diversity is a result of everything that happens in the organization. It's not just about who you hire, but it's also who is actually able to do their work, who is going to be happy in the company, who is going to leave. And in fact, a lot of the reason why so many companies have poor diversity is because, not so much because they don't hire enough people, but it's because those people tend to leave. So if you look at a typical example, I don't know, in a financial services company, and you look at women, and you find that the representation of women is lower than the representation of men, chances are that you will find that a lot more women leave the company earlier than men. So the question is, why are they leaving? Well, they're leaving because of the things that happen to them day to day in the workplace. In other words, inclusion is about what you as an organization do, what every individual is doing. It's a combination of the individual behaviors, but also your policies, your regulations, the systems that you have. If you have a building that is not accessible to people that have disabilities, then you're going to have fewer people with disabilities. If you have a culture where it's okay to make dirty jokes during meetings, then women are going to feel uncomfortable. If you have a culture that does not value Black people, if you're in the United States, then of course you're going to have fewer Black people in the organization. Or, so it's about, inclusion is about the things that you do as an organization that impact the experiences of individuals. The result is diversity. Diversity is just a snapshot. It's the outcome of everything that you do as an organization to your people. and what the people do to each other. So that's why I always say inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get.
So the inclusion is the inputs and the diversity is the output of those that we put into what we do, right?
You can think of them as inputs and outputs, or more as actions and outcomes. I think is the way that I like to think of it better, because input sounds a little bit passive, but this is literally, it's more about the things that are happening within the organization, as opposed to diversity, which is the outcome. And so that's the way that I like to think about it.
Yes. So before we go into how to measure and the work that you do to make it measure the inclusion, I want to ask this question, and I know there's a lot of people asking this question, but we didn't have the good answers. So long ago, when I first get into a workforce, I always hear the word people as our greatest assets, right? And then those sounds good, but then for many years, we didn't see much of that. That's why we have the imbalance. That why we have the issues of D&I around. And then recently that becoming something hot to share. So what happened to those leaders back then for saying something that they didn't even put into actions and make it happen though?
I think actually you're hitting on a very important point. I think that unfortunately our economy took a turn probably in the late 80s, when the idea of shareholder primacy started to take hold, and the idea that basically without capital there would be no organizations. And unfortunately what has happened is that a lot of people have, in my opinion, even though some people, when they say that, they don't necessarily mean that in a harmful way, it has been very harmful, because unchecked, that concept basically makes it possible for anybody who either has money or controls a company to be incredibly greedy. And problem is that if you take that at face value, what it basically says, it's a very extreme statement in the sense that it says shareholder primacy shouldn't mean the only thing that matters is shareholders and capital. It should mean we need to be paying attention to that. Unfortunately, today what we're seeing is what in my opinion is a very harmful and extreme form of that. And one of the ways that you can see that, for example, is the compensation of CEOs. There are studies that show that the compensation of CEOs over the last 30 years or so has skyrocketed to the point where a typical CEO makes, hundreds, if not thousands of times as much money as the median income of other people in the company. Now, when that happened, unfortunately, I believe that one of the reasons why this has not been countered is actually very closely tied to what I do. And I can tell you that one of my dreams in the long term is to apply the ideas that I'm using right now at the level of companies to understand those broader economic issues. What is the problem? In my opinion, people are the most valuable asset of any organization, because you might argue without capital, an organization would not exist. I can also argue without people, an organization would not exist, right?
Yeah.
And so how do you quantify the value of one versus the other? And this goes back to what I enjoy doing, which is the quantification. I think that right now we don't have any tools that can tell us exactly how much is the CEO of a company contributing, how much is the VP of sales contributing, how much is the janitor contributing, how much is the secretary contributing. We don't have a way of quantifying that. So there is this implicit assumption that the CEO, or without the CEO, the company would fail. Now, what's very interesting is that, yes, there are examples where the CEO clearly is the driver, but there have been studies that show very conclusively that you can change the CEO of a company without really having a negative impact. And there are situations in which the CEO can actually have a very negative impact, right? So what I'd love to be able to do someday is to be able to quantify that, and to be able to, let's say, run simulations and say, okay, let's run the simulation. Let's see what happens if I take out this person. Let's see what happens if I take out that person. I wrote an article once when I was saying in my blog on Forbes. I said, look, imagine a company like Amazon during the pandemic. I know that at the time the CEO of Amazon, not Jeff Bezos, the other guy, and I apologize, I forget his name right now. Somebody had pointed out that his salary was equivalent to something like 17,000 times the salary of a typical driver. And I said, which would have a more negative impact on Amazon? If all of a sudden 17,000 drivers in my city all disappeared, or if the CEO changed, right? So I think this has been a really big problem, is that I believe that the economy, because of the self-serving interest of people that control some of these roles, they have lost sight of the balance between treating people adequately and the value that they bring to the company and making money. And one of the things that this is actually, you've hit kind of one of the core ideas that I always tell people when they say, why should I care about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I say, well, look, if you think of people as assets, we know that when we have assets of any kind, we know that diversification always works, right? So we have portfolio management to diversify our financial assets. You wouldn't buy just one stock for your entire portfolio, right? You want to diversify. We have programmatic advertising to diversify our marketing assets to increase sales. So if we had tools to understand how the diversification of our employees can increase the performance of our employees, that could potentially squeeze more efficiency and greater performance out of our employees. And people say, well, yeah, that's true, but it's complicated with people. I said, well, here's one problem that a lot of people don't realize. If you look, and I know the numbers from the United States, I don't know from the rest of the world, but I think in the United States it's even more of an issue. But if you look at advertising across the entire United States, every single company, every form of advertising, we were spending about $250 to $300 billion a year. So let's call it $300 billion a year. That's a lot of money. But when you look at the payroll that those same companies spend in 1 year, it's more than $8 trillion. The ratio is close to 30 to 1. In other words, we spend roughly 30 times as much as a society, as an economy. We spend 30 times as much on personnel, on payroll, than we do on advertising. So my question to any leader, especially of large organizations, is this. If you have 10 people in your company whose job is to optimize your advertising, not just all advertising, just to optimize your advertising, you should have 300 people whose job is to optimize the diversification of your employees, which is a joke because right now no company has 300 people working in diversity and inclusion. So when you think of it that way, and this is why when you ask that question about the value of things like that this is why the value of people. I think that a lot of corporations are forgetting that. A lot of corporations are treating people not as an asset, but as a liability. There was a great book by a gentleman named Peter Capelli, in which he talks about the fact that, unfortunately, the way that accounting is set up, people appear on financial books primarily as a liability. If you spend money to train your people, that's actually a cost. It's considered an additional cost. Whereas if you invest money to repair a piece of equipment, that's actually considered an investment. And so I think that's a terrible, terrible thing that I think has happened in our economy. And I think ultimately the problem that we don't realize is that it is benefiting a few people, like the very, very top is benefiting from it. Everybody else is suffering. Everybody else is actually suffering. And the result is you get low engagement, high turnover, a lot of dissatisfaction, people that change jobs all the time. So I think that ultimately it really hurts companies, but it's very difficult to see.
Yeah. And in my principle, I believe that we want to do good things for people, all right? And including those CEOs up there, and then they want to do good things for the people that they're hiring, like put it that way. And for the past many years, the measurement wasn't ready yet, right? So they have the feelings that it needs to be done, but they don't know how to quantify it. They don't know how to measure the result and how that initiative will leading to the bigger outcomes for their organization, and that's become less of the priority for what they need to do, right? And those management, like you say earlier, also like the people become a liability in the balance sheet and stuff like that. That makes them think differently, all right? So and we thank you for putting the efforts to make from the feelings onto something that can be measuring. And you make something that very vague and complex to something that could be quantifiable and could lead into the result. Share with us, how did you come up with that idea, and who involved into that process with you to make it happen, though?
It's another really good question, and it's funny because they say that the best ideas like really simple ideas, and simple ideas oftentimes it's really hard to find them. It just takes a long time, and once you click onto something you realize like, wow, that's so simple. And in the case of inclusion, in fact, the reason why we started to focus on inclusion was because we realized that idea that the diversity is the outcome. I had built a computer simulation that shows how in an organization, if you are not treating people the same way. And what I did is actually in particular one simulation in which we looked at how promotion impacts the diversity of a company. And we realized that if you are not, even if you're making a slight imbalance in how you promote people, let's say men versus women, you end up with companies that look exactly like what you see today, where it accumulates and you end up with mostly men at the leadership and a lot of women down at the lower levels. And so I was using the simulation, and somebody asked me and said, hey, can I use that to simulate what happens in my company? I'll give you all of my diversity data. And I realized that the diversity data was useless. What I needed to understand was what is happening to the people. What are we doing to the people that is making them want to leave the organization, or that's making some people get promoted instead of others? And so I came up with this idea. I was like, well, how do I measure that? And what we realized is that the way to do it is to ask people not about whether they feel included, but to ask them about experiences that have interfered with what happens to them at work. And in other words, what we are actually measuring is not inclusion, but exclusion. And then one of the things that I realized, I love to use analogies, and I realized that there's a very close analogy between inclusion and health, in the sense that when we introduced ourselves, I didn't say, hi, I'm Paolo and I'm very healthy. You didn't say, hi, I'm Hao and I'm very healthy. But suppose that I've been coughing, or maybe I had a patch on my eye because I'd had some eye surgery or something like that. Then I would have noticed it and I would have said something. In other words, we don't notice when we're healthy, we notice when we're sick. Inclusion is the same way. We tend not to notice when we're being included, but we notice when we're being excluded. And that, as it turns out, leads to a very, very important observation. If you think about health, I don't know about you, I tend to be very healthy. I've had a few injuries and a few things like that, but generally speaking, knock on wood, as we say, I'm a healthy individual. I don't know a lot about disease. There are a lot of diseases that I don't even know the name. I don't know what the symptoms are, and even if you told me about your symptoms, I would have no idea how to cure it. Inclusion works the same way. If you are the most included person, then you do not understand exclusion, you do not understand what the symptoms are, and even if somebody tells you what the symptoms are, you would have no idea how to fix it. Now, here's the problem. In a company, who are the people that are the most included? They're the leaders. They're the white, male, cisgender, heterosexual leaders here in the United States, which means that the people that are leading companies, the people that are making the most decisions, are the least qualified to see it, to understand it, and to know how to fix it. So when we realize that by measuring inclusion and literally by measuring exclusion, we can give these leaders visibility into what exactly is happening in their organizations. And we found this unique way of quantifying it by essentially we do workshops where we ask people we explain these ideas about diversity and inclusion. Inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get. We talk about different analogies, we talk about different examples of things that happen in the workplace. And then we ask them to go to a confidential online platform that we developed. And we ask them to share confidentially, we don't know who they are, some experiences that have made them feel uncomfortable in the workplace. And it doesn't have to be necessarily about, oh, I insulted you because you're gay. It could be things like, hey, I've been trying to get my computer repaired and it's taken me 3 weeks to do that. And then we have a very simple way of categorizing them where we say things like, well, did this experience have to do with your compensation? Did it have to do with your career advancement? Did it have to do with your work-life balance? So the kinds of things, the cluster, think of those as being the symptoms, just like in a disease. And we've come up with a list of about 8 or 9 symptoms like that. And we also want to know what caused it. Was it your leadership? Was it a policy in your company? Was it your direct manager? Was it your peers? Was it your clients? And with that information, we get an amazing combination of quantitative data that tells us where are the biggest symptoms in the organization, what are the biggest causes of the symptoms, and then we also get detailed explanations that say this is exactly what's happening. For example, you may hear people say, my colleagues never, always forget to invite me to meetings. And if you see that 20 times, 30 times, 50 times, you know that it's a problem in the entire organization. It means that they're not very careful about how they organize meetings. And if you also see that the majority of those experiences happen to women, then you know that there may be some unconscious bias where a lot of male managers are kind of forgetting to invite women. Maybe they're just grabbing lunch with their buddy and they're like, hey, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And the next thing you know, they make a decision and other people were left out. And so that was really the genesis of measuring inclusion, was the realization that for me, building the simulations, just knowing the race and gender and ethnicity and sexual orientation of the people was useless. I needed to know what happens to Ha in his company as a function of the fact that he's Asian and he's got this education and, and things of that sort. What happens to a woman in this other company? What happens to a black person in this other company? And that's how we figured out how to measure inclusion, and it gives an incredible visibility to the leaders because now they can see exactly what is happening, and they can, with the help of experts, they can figure out how to fix it.
So for many of our listeners are the business leaders, and they want to move the needle in the inclusions, because the diversity, like you're saying here, is what they get for their companies, right? And then if we move the needle for what we do as inclusions, is right, then the outcome and what they get at the diversity and the performance of the organization as a whole will be better. How do they get in touch with you, Paulo?
Well, I've been fortunate that I do a lot of public speaking. I've done a couple of TED Talks. I write for Forbes regularly. I do a lot of invited talks for conferences and for clients. And so so far I've been fortunate that a lot of people have come to me and they've heard about the work that I do, and they'll say, wow, this is really interesting. Can you come talk to my leadership, and then let's do a project? But in general, it's one of the things that I think has been challenging about what I think of as the DEI bubble that happened, between 2020 and 2023. I think the events that followed after the murder of George Floyd here in the United States and the pandemic, that basically made a lot of people aware of some of the incredible injustices that happen in our society. And that caused a lot of interest. But unfortunately, a lot of that was, I think of it as a bubble. I've lived through other economic bubbles when you see a very sharp growth and a lot of confusion about what is the right tool and how do I do it. That's not a good thing, because a lot of people rush into the field. A lot of people that are not necessarily equipped, or there's not a lot of standardization. There's not a lot of accepted good best practices. And then what happens is that it leads to backlash, especially when people focus too much on diversity. And by the way, I think diversity is a very important thing, but to me, the reason why inclusion is so much more important is because ultimately, if everybody had an equal chance to succeed, then there would not be any problems and you would get naturally more diverse companies, right? But so this has been really, really difficult for people to understand. And when they try to focus on diversity targets, that's where the backlash comes. That's where people say, well, wait a second. If you're going to hire this many women and people of color, it means that I, as a white man, am going to be suffering from that. And I've written articles about how this backlash has come because of too much focus on diversity. So I talk about these things, people read about it, I get invited to speak, I get invited to do projects. But right now, one of my biggest goals is to get out as much as possible. And I'm writing a book that's going to be out in September to really explain to people, let's stop focusing only on diversity for the sake of diversity. Let's start to understand that creating better inclusion is going to lead to greater diversity and greater performance. And that's something that is very difficult for people to grasp, because they think that diversity by itself is very good. And if I can tell you one more thing that I always tell clients or people when I'm speaking, I say, look, suppose that you're in a company and the chief diversity officer and the CEO say, we see the light. We think it's important to increase diversity. So we're going to increase the number of women from 20% to 30% and the number of people of color from 8% to 12%. And you do the math and you say, well, that means that you're going to have to lose, even if the company grows, it means you're going to have to lose some white men. And when you do that, people get all upset about it. And then I say, well, it's true that focusing on the numbers of people is a form of discrimination. And unfortunately, that's not legal, even if you're doing it to benefit people that have been historically underrepresented. But I say, but let me ask you, what would you really want? Imagine that you can be in that company. Imagine that 3 years later, you walk into a meeting with a lot of people from the company and you look around and ask them, which would you prefer? Would you prefer to see that, in fact, the number of women has increased, the number of people of color has increased, the number of people with disabilities has increased, but they're still treated very poorly? Or would you prefer to see a company where maybe the numbers are not as good as you would like them to be, but people respect you, people hear your ideas, people include you in their meetings, people actually pay attention to what you do, people allow you to do projects that are using your skills? Which of those two would you prefer to see? And most people say, well, I would prefer to see the second one of these. Well, that means you want inclusion, not diversity. And this goes back, if I can say one more thing, the problem with diversity being an outcome is that, go back to the 1960s, affirmative action in the United States. Businesses begin to talk about this idea of diversity in corporations. We see, when we measure diversity, that there is something wrong. Diversity is the only metric that we've had until very recently to tell us whether something is wrong, but it's the output. And so what happens? You're a black person in a company, you're treated horribly. In the United States, even today, if you're a black person, you have a life that is so much worse than if you're a white person like me. I'm incredibly privileged in this country. But you can't just complain about that. So what do, you look at the numbers and say, look, there are not enough black people in the company. And now you start to focus on diversity, but that's the output. And I like to give one more analogy, if I may, which is that imagine that I walk in the house one day and I feel very cold and I look at the thermostat and it reads, oh, it's only 8 degrees Celsius. So what do? I light a match under the thermostat. And all of a sudden the thermostat now is reading 15 degrees, 20 degrees, 25 degrees. But meanwhile, the windows are open and the door is drafty and the roof is leaking. When we try to fix diversity by hiring more diverse people, we're making the same mistake. We're lighting a match under the thermostat. And if you're not careful, you burn the house down. And so these are all the reasons why I think it's so crucial to get the word out, why it's so crucial to talk to people and to get them to understand that, yes, diversity is important, but really what matters is inclusion. Society is diverse. We're not going to make society more diverse, right? We just need to create an inclusive environment so that everyone in our society has the same ability to succeed in the workplace, which will naturally make a lot of companies more diverse. And that's what I'm aiming for.
So when you say that diversity has been in the market in the 1960s, so it's like 60-something years already, it's becoming a single the single measurement for so many years, so people don't know how to do it differently. Assuming that leaders want to change, so what is a roadmap for them to do to promote inclusions as a core for making the the shift in their culture?
Yeah, when we work with organizations, I always start with awareness. I always start with educating people about why inclusion is so important, how inclusion can be measured, and what would be the benefits of focusing on inclusion. The fact that it removes the backlash, the fact that you can link it directly to your bottom line in your company, the fact that you can actually measure it today and immediately make a change and see it change very quickly. Diversity takes years to change, right? Even if you do things. So the most important thing is for leaders to understand, first of all, what inclusion means. And, I want to be careful because, again, there are a lot of definitions of inclusion, and I'm not saying that any one of them is right or any one of them is wrong. But what I'm saying is that if you have a definition that takes you 80 words to explain it, 100 words to explain it, and it's a circular definition, and it doesn't give you a tangible way of changing it, then it's not a very useful definition. So I'm not saying that my definition of inclusion is better or more accurate. In fact, it's more that I say behaviors of people in an organization are what matters, and I'm going to call that inclusion. Maybe it's the wrong term, but that's the way that I like to think about it. So educate the leaders, explain to them why focusing on diversity alone is a mistake, and that they should focus on diversity as an outcome and think about inclusion as the tool to help them to achieve that outcome. And when you do that, you then show them the metrics. And by the way, in my book, one of the things that I do is that, of course, I love to get clients and I want people to work with us, but I also realize that a lot of organizations want to do it on their own. And we give them step-by-step instructions of, okay, if you want to measure inclusion on your own, here is how you do it. You want to ask these kinds of questions. You want to be measuring exclusion. Here's how you can analyze the data. Here's the kinds of things that you should be looking for. And the combination of the stories that people share confidentially and the data behind it will really guide you in where to go. And that's what, but that's my hope is, as I said, it's this idea that it's really a beautifully simple idea. The way that you treat people ultimately has an impact on how they perform. And the way that people perform impact how the organization performs. It's a really simple idea, but we've been so focused on the wrong metric, or not the wrong metric, but we've been focusing on the only metric that we have. And it's a very indirect metric. It's not a leading indicator. And that's what I'm trying to get people to think about, is think about other ways of measuring it. And the way that we're proposing happens to be very powerful because it can really link to what is happening in your organization.
Beautiful. And I like the word leading indicator. Thanks for making that leading indicator. So in case that people want to contact you, what is the best way for them to contact you, Paolo?
The best way is probably either to just email me. So it's Paolo, Paolo, at aleria.tech. Aleria, I think it's aleria.tech. Also, if you look for me on LinkedIn, Paolo Gaudiano, there are not that many. I think I'm probably the only one that's out there on LinkedIn. And I'm always happy to hear from people that are interested in pursuing some of this work.
Wow. And I would definitely spread the words out, because I love to see organizations like you do the analogies. When you look at the organization in 20 years from now, what do you want to see? Between the two, which one is you as a leader prefer to see. And by that example, then we do have what we want to see, but we need to have a tool, the leaderness, to make sure that happens. So it's good that you are doing. Thank you. We still have a little time to talk about your book. Is that talkable, shareable?
So yes, the book right now, there is actually a page, if you go to Amazon and some of the other booksellers, it's available for pre-purchase, but it's called Measuring Inclusion, Higher Profits and Happier People Without Guesswork or Backlash. And I really tried to, I started working on this book about a little over a year ago, and it was very interesting because I could see the tide turning against DEI, and it was the beginning of the backlash, and now the backlash has become very vocal, especially here in the United States. So yes, my book is titled Measuring Inclusion, Higher Profits, Happier People Without Guesswork or Backlash. And I really wanted to emphasize the fact that the work that I'm proposing is not the same old way of arguing why we need to be more diverse. It's not talking about fairness and justice. It's really saying, look, you can make more money, you can have happier people, and you can do that in a way that will not actually create, and you can do it in a way that will not create backlash and that will not make people angry at you. And the guesswork, I refer to the fact that, again, so much of the work that is being done today is not very quantifiable because it takes so long to see things change. And so if you go to Amazon or Barnes and Noble or any bookseller, you should find a page. If you do a search for Measuring Inclusion associated with my name, you should find information about the book. And basically what I try to do in the book is to take a very neutral stance, because I understand and I appreciate that there's a lot of right now animosity between people who have been traditionally underappreciated, underrepresented, and the people who are members of the majority, at least in this country, who feel that they're under attack. And in a way, I think both groups are right. And I think that the focus on diversity really creates this division. By definition, diversity is a relative thing. It's about differences. So what I try to do in my book is to say, listen, there are reasons why both groups are right, and there are reasons why both groups are wrong. And I think that we as a field of DI have to acknowledge that we've made some mistakes, and the people that have caused some of these disparities have to acknowledge that they've made mistakes. And I'm not here to yell at people about the mistakes they've made. I'm trying to explain how we can get beyond that and figure out a way to work together that does not cause any one group to suffer for the other, that actually makes things better for everyone. And that's really the whole book is set up to say, here's why we should do it, and then to give very practical examples. I have case studies in it of 4 different kinds of organizations that range from a startup to a global 500 corporation. I have actual data that I show of studies that we've done. I talk about how exactly you can do this on your own, and then I have a couple of chapters to talk about some of the wrong ideas that people, or not the wrong ideas, but some of the mistakes that people have made that have led us to have this very negative, sense of antagonism between, pro-diversity and against diversity.
Wow, and I really look forward to reading that book. I think that a lot of leaders also need to read that book to fix the differences, and to build something better for their organizations. For a long time, I had the same feeling, especially during the pandemic, when there's so many talks about that and so many initiatives about diversity and stuff like that. Then we see a lot of things that's not really going right. And so I hope that they can fix it, and they can fix it for good. So 2 last questions. All right, and the last question is about thinking. So Paolo, you have a really good thinker, and you are making people to think better, and so that they can do something better. And my wife and I, we've been on the quest to help people to improve their ability to think, because we believe that our thinking capability these days has been diminishing with so many noises out there, right? So what is your secret to help you to think better over the years?
I think, it goes back to something that I said earlier about my fascination with this idea of complexity. Our brains are pretty much wired to think linearly, 1, 2, 3, 4. And our, we tend to extrapolate from our experiences, and we say, well, if things are going this way, they're going to continue to go that way. When you deal with complexity, so one of the definitions of a complex system is a system that has a lot of interacting parts in which the behavior of the system as a whole emerges as a result of the interactions. So think of a sports team. Why do we not know which team is going to win? You know, and I use a sports analogy, but you can use a lot of analogies. The marketplace, you know, you may know what every individual is doing, but you cannot predict the price of different stocks or the composition of a company. These are all examples of complexity, and our brains are simply not able to think about the connection between one person and lots of people and what happens at the societal level. There are courses out there, there are books out there, there are ways of thinking about systems and how to link the individual to the broader system. And I wish that those kinds of topics were actually more commonly taught at, you know, all the way from high school level, if you will, because there are things that it's a very, very different way to think. And I think in a way, statistical thinking, which is what so many people use as, you know, to quantify and analyze, is very damaging because statistics by definition hides details. It's designed to hide details. It's designed to give you abstractions. And I think that, unfortunately, statistics is incredibly powerful, incredibly useful, but we also need to find a way to remain aware of the link between the individuals and the statistical data that we see. So my hope, and you know, I was very fortunate because my own upbringing, my own interest led me to a lot of problems where I had to learn to think that way. It's not something that I think you can teach instantaneously, but I've actually taught a graduate course for many years. I used to teach at Boston University as a professor, but then when I started to do this professional work on complexity science, I've taught at Tufts University, at the City College of New York, at NYU, and I teach these courses on what I call managing complexity in business and society. Unfortunately, it's not something that you can find. It's not a common topic, but I wish that that became a more focused area of our teaching, because I think that's what's causing so many problems. We focus on little points. We see one thing that we don't like and we say, oh, that's wrong. It's not right that you're not paying men and women the same, and it's not right that you do this. And we fail to understand what are the root causes. What are the microscopic things that lead to those emergent outcomes? And there's not a secret sauce that I could tell you, oh, here's how you can change your thinking. It's really just learning to recognize the difference between what happens at the individual level, what happens at the system level, and how those two can be linked.
It doesn't sound simple to me. So give us some example, just one little tips that, you know, if tomorrow I wake up and I want to, you know, start to practice that kind of, you know, learning about what happened to people and what happened to the bigger picture. So what is the practice for me to start noticing this and changing in my behavior?
Well, I do an activity in the classes that I teach where I use the labels structural and emergent. Okay. And let me give you an example. Like an example that we all are familiar with is traffic. How many times have you been stuck in traffic out there? Here's what's interesting about traffic. When you get in your car, you want to go from point A to point B and you want to get there quickly. Everybody else that is driving on the road wants to do exactly the same thing. So at the structural level, there are individual drivers that want to go somewhere and they drive in a certain way. At the emergent level, you get traffic jams, which are exactly the opposite of what everybody wants, right? So that's an example of learning to recognize the difference between something that is structural versus something that is emergent. Every time that you read an article about something, I invite people to think about, okay, what part of this article is talking about the structure and what part is talking about the emergence? So if you hear people say, you know, if you read an article that says the Fed is trying to increase interest rates to decrease inflation. So the structural part is the Fed, you know, the Federal Reserve in the United States is trying to decrease or to change a structural part of our economy, which is the interest rates of what you pay to borrow money. And what they're hoping is that the emergent result will be a decrease in inflation. Inflation is an enormously macroscopic measure that requires looking at many, many numbers over all of society. So what I invite people to do is whenever you're reading an article, whenever you're facing a problem, try to think about which pieces of things are structural, which are emergent. The reason why that's so important is that like inclusion is structural, diversity is emergent. You cannot change diversity. It's like lighting a match on the thermostat. The temperature in my house that I read in the thermostat is emergent. The open windows, the leaky roof, the drafty door are structural. You cannot change emergent phenomena. You can only change the structure of the system.
Um,
You cannot change the churn rate of your employees. You can change how you treat your employees so that they're more likely to leave. You cannot change market share directly. You can change the price of your product. So I encourage people to really learn to recognize when they're talking about something that is the structure and when they're talking something about that is emergent. And if you want to make solutions that say, oh, we need to change our market share, you need to go one level deeper. You need to understand what that means and how you get there, because you can only change the structure. You can't buy market share, right?
yeah. Wow. When are you going to write the book about that? And because so many of us are thinking about the now and the tomorrow without being able to see 10 years from now, the emerging, what happened going to be happening in the next 10 years. So you owe us a book on that one.
So I actually, it's funny that you asked that. Several years ago, we're talking like 10 years ago, I actually started to write that book when I was teaching a course, and there were no textbooks that taught these things. And then I talked to a couple of publishers. It was just felt that people were like, this is too weird. It's like, why do we need this? And I didn't do a very good job of explaining why we need that. The work that I'm doing in diversity and inclusion came from 20 years of focusing on those ideas and realizing that I could apply them to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Measuring Inclusion is my first book, but I guarantee you that sometime in the future, I will write the other book as well. I will write a book about the methodology behind it, because I agree it's a very important topic. It's something that I would love to see more widely spread out, because I think it also eliminates a lot of the arguments that we see, because people often argue at the emergent level. And the problem is that you make big statements about things at the emergent level. Oh, we need more diversity. What does that mean? We need greater. We need to. So you have companies that want to focus on profitability, and individuals that want to focus on diversity. They're both emergent level things. And what I show them with my book is how, if you go down to this level, at the structural level of how you treat people, you're going to impact both of them. And that's something that I hope comes through very clearly in my book. But yes, I appreciate your comments. It is a very, very powerful way of thinking about problems, and one that has served me really well in my life, both professionally and personally.
Yep. And because you set the goal to solve the meta question, so that's why you work on the structural to get to the emergent level, and you have people to get there. Thanks a lot for doing that. We need more people that can build that skill and the strength to do the same thing, so that we can tackle the issues around us, right? I say there are two questions, so but along the way I asked so many smaller questions in the first one. The second question is about the future. So we know the younger version want to become a marine biologist, right? And then emerge into different role and different things. Now you're an expert in inclusions, and we want to know in the future a little bit, Paolo. Is there anything that you are doing excitingly? Do you want to share with me and the audience so we can celebrate with you in advance?
Well, right now I am in the process of growing my startup, and that's always very exciting. And I don't know how long it's going to take, but I'm really excited about the potential impact that the work that I'm doing may have in the future. The one thing that has been in the back of my head, and we've already touched on that earlier, when I talked about things like shareholder primacy, and you talk about labor and unions. We didn't really talk about that, but I think that there are a lot of problems in our society that are due to our inability to connect the individual and the collective. This idea to go from structural to emergent. I dream someday of being able to take the same ideas that I brought to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And by the way, I've used the same ideas to solve a bunch of other problems for a lot of different industries, but usually for individual companies. Someday, I would love to be able to influence decision makers at the level of political, government decision making, providing tools and providing a way to think that helps to make better decisions about how to manage society. People talk about conscious capitalism and the problems of different kinds of greed and this and that and the other, but a lot of that is based on your reactions to what you see happening at the emergent level, and it's very difficult to think at the microscopic level. And I would love to be able to use my work. And I also have a nonprofit. Right now it's not very active. I'm only working on one project, but I have a nonprofit whose goal ultimately is to apply the same idea of complexity science to and diversity and inclusion, but really at the level of societies. How do you get labor unions to actually work in consonance with corporations so that it's better for everybody? How do you get people, governments to pass laws that are actually beneficial to citizens in a way that actually makes the country better? how do you make schools change their education system so that the results are better for everyone. So I would love to get to the point where I'm essentially running a think tank where we use the same methodology with these computer simulations and this thinking about complexity to address some of the really most challenging problems that our society is facing.
Beautiful. Wow. Wow, I love it. I love it. Thanks a lot for sharing that. And I hope that, you spent 20 years to think of the idea of inclusions, and then it takes 20 years of your works for you to persuade the people, to persuade the leader to buy in and to make change, right? I hope that next journey is going to be shorter with a lot more people, walking on that path with you to get it happen. All right. And I thank you for doing that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Very, very good questions.
Yeah, Paolo, thanks a lot for spending your time with us tonight and share so many good insights. I really appreciate that. I hope one day I can see you in New York or in Vietnam, and we can have a face-to-face meeting with a cup of coffee or beers together, and for me to learn more from you and your life. Okay?
Absolutely. Or in Rome. I spent quite a bit of my time in Italy as well because my father is very old, so I go back and forth between Rome and New York a lot. But would love to come to Vietnam because, as I said, it is on the bucket list for both my wife and me. So hope to be able to meet in person at some point. And if you are in New York or in Italy, please let me know.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Please say hello to your father and your wife for me, okay?
Okay, excellent. Say hi to your wife. And again, thank you so much and really enjoyed meeting you.
You too. Bye-bye. Have a wonderful day.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
Ciao.